Thank you so much to everyone for being here tonight, and of course thanks to the elders for giving me this opportunity. We are missing a significant number because of camp. Don't worry, Darren already made the obvious joke to me of they're not here because you're preaching. So if anyone was worried that joke wasn't going to be made, Mr. Ferris did it for us. We are missing many for camp, and I do fondly miss my time at camp. But I'm going to tell you, I think y'all are lucky y'all are here and not there. And that is because I don't think this whole next week they're going to hear a Bible lesson exclusively about the book of Chronicles. Chronicles is my personal favorite book of the Bible, and it's a unique choice. If you've ever studied the book of Chronicles, then more than likely what you did was it was a study over the time of the kings of Judah and Israel. And so what you probably did was you would go through in chronological order each of the kings, and you flipped back and forth between Kings and Chronicles so that you could get all the information about the kings. This is important. However, I believe when we study the books of Kings and Chronicles like that, we don't do them all the justice that they deserve. And I want to give us kind of an example. All books of the Bible are written with a specific purpose, and we understand that. There are 66 books in our Bible today. They were written over a period of about 1,000 years, and they were written a long time ago. It's amazing when you look at it from a historical standpoint how well preserved the books we have are over such a long period of time, and we've kept them, and we have so many copies. When you compare it to any other book written or any other pieces of literature written in similar times, it's amazing how many more copies we have of all the different books of the Bible than we do of just about any other pieces of literature from history. So God has gone through great trouble to make sure that we have these 66 books of the Bible. And we have them today in the year 2019. And so we need to realize what you might think with the book of Chronicles is it's just a history book. But God went through a lot of trouble to make sure we have the book of Chronicles. It's not just a history book. For example, we look at the Gospels. The Gospels are all about the time of Jesus. But it'd be a disservice to just say the Gospels are a history of the life of Jesus. They were all letters, and they are all written to different people for different purposes. So the first one I have, Matthew. Mostly was written to Jews. It kind of highlights how Jesus is the fulfillment of the promises to David and Abraham, which would have really resonated with a Jewish audience. You compare that to the book of Luke. Luke was written, it starts off being written to most excellent Theophilus. It's more of the gospel, but from the point of view to a Gentile audience. And so it focuses on different things than the book of Matthew. And then John. John was written at a later time, and it's written kind of specifically to combat kind of false reports or rumors about Jesus. And it really highlights how Jesus is the Messiah and is the Son of God, because it was written at a time when lots of false teachers were teaching that Jesus wasn't the Son of God. And so in those three Gospels, you could just say, yeah, they're the history of Jesus. But when you just focus on one Gospel, you realize there's a specific message in each of those Gospels. And so I believe this is very similar for the book of Chronicles and the book of Kings. Both are written about basically the same time period. However, they're written to different audiences, and they're written for different purposes. One common misconception people have about the book of Chronicles, and probably why many people think it's just a book of history, is many verses like this one. I pulled this one at random, but you can find a very similar sentiment after almost any king in the book of Kings. 2 Kings 24:5, now the rest of the deeds of Jehoiakim and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? Many people will see that while reading the book of Kings, which I hope we all read the book of Kings daily, and they'll think, it's talking about the book of Chronicles. We have the book of Chronicles. That's not what that is referencing. It's a coincidence that it uses the word Chronicles here, and then the book we have in our Bible is Chronicles. We know this because Chronicles was written several hundred years after the book of Kings. So Kings can't be referencing the book of Chronicles. What this is, and you'll see this after every king in Kings and Chronicles, where it will reference where you can find more information about them. What this is it's saying you can find out the rest of this in this book. There were history books written, royal documents and official, where they kept up with all the details in the history of all the kings. We don't have those today. We have the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. We don't just have a history of this time period. We have books that were written for a specific purpose. And so I want to highlight the difference in their purposes. The theme of Kings can be found in 1 Kings chapter 9 and verses 4 through 7. It's a little bit longer. But God appears to Solomon, and he tells him this. And as for you, if you will walk before me, as David your father walked, with integrity of heart and uprightness, doing according to all that I have commanded you, and keeping my statutes and my rules, then I will establish your royal throne over Israel forever, as I promised David your father, saying, you shall not lack a man on the throne of Israel. But if you turn aside from following me, you or your children, and do not keep my commandments and my statutes that I have set before you, but go and serve other gods and worship them, then I will cut off Israel from the land that I have given them, and the house that I have consecrated for my name I will cast out of my sight, and Israel will become a proverb and a byword among all peoples. Kings was written to the exiles shortly after they'd been taken into exile by Babylon. And the purpose of the book, this is the theme, you're in exile. This is why you're in exile. You're being punished because God promised you that if you mess up, he's going to punish you. The temple is consecrated, or the people have trouble believing, how could the temple of the Lord be destroyed? God said right here, this is what's going to happen to the temple, to my people, to my land, if y'all don't listen to me. And so you'll see throughout Kings, it focuses more on this is where you guys messed up. Chronicles is written at a much later date, I already said that, and the theme of it is 2 Chronicles 7:14. It's one of my favorite verses. If my people, who are called by my name, humble themselves, and pray and seek my face, and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and heal their land. Chronicles was written at a later date. It was either written right before the exiles were going to return or shortly after the exiles did return back to the promised land. And it focuses on the way back to God. Kings shows them why they were punished. Chronicles shows them how they get back to being right in God's eyes. And you can tell this throughout the books. They're written over the same period of history, but the writers of the books picked and chose different stories to illustrate their 2 points. And so you'll notice this in the first example with what the writers choose to include from the 2 accounts. The first one, and it's the best example of the difference between the 2 books, is the story of Manasseh. If you're familiar with Manasseh, king of Judah, he's most famous for sacrificing his own children to false gods, real great king. And most interestingly, everything we have about Manasseh is written down in 2 Kings 21 and 2 Chronicles 33. The first 9 or 10 verses of those 2 chapters are almost identical. Verse 2 of both chapters say, he did evil in the sight of the Lord. Verse 3 of both chapters, he rebuilt the high places that his father Hezekiah tore down. Verses 4 and 5 highlight that the very temple of the Lord, Manasseh built altars to false gods in them so that he could worship gods other than the true Yahweh. Verse 9 shows that he led Judah to do more evil than the nations the Lord had destroyed before them. God's own people under Manasseh's rule were worse than the people they drove out of the land. God's people are unrecognizable at this point, and it's all Manasseh's fault. He was a terrible king, and we have it in 2 different chapters of the Bible telling us just how bad he was. However, after those first 9 verses, there are stark differences between the accounts in both. Kings, next in verses 10 through 15 of 2 Kings 21, God pronounces his judgment on the nation of Judah because of Manasseh. And we're going to turn here. It's real interesting language that God chooses to use. 2 Kings 21. Verses 10 through 15. And the Lord said by his servants the prophets, because Manasseh, king of Judah, has committed these abominations and has done things more evil than all that the Amorites did, who were before him, and has made Judah also to sin with his idols, therefore, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, behold, I am bringing upon Jerusalem and Judah such disaster that the ears of everyone who hears of it will tingle. And I will stretch over Jerusalem the measuring line of Samaria and the plumb line of the house of Ahab. And I will wipe Jerusalem as one wipes a dish, wiping it and turning it upside down. And they shall become a prey and a spoil to all their enemies, because they have done what is evil in my sight and have provoked me to anger, since the day their fathers came out of Egypt, even to this day. And then verse 16 starts off, moreover, Manasseh shed very much innocent blood. Manasseh was terrible. Manasseh's actions were so bad that the nation of Judah was going to be taken off into captivity, no matter what. There's no going back from this point. The people are so evil, God has pronounced his judgment, and he will wipe them like a dish. Chronicles is very different, though. If you would, turn to 2 Chronicles chapter 33. Second Chronicles chapter 33, starting in verse 10. The Lord spoke to Manasseh and to his people, but they paid no attention. Therefore, the Lord brought upon them the commanders of the army of the king of Assyria, who captured Manasseh with hooks and bound him with chains of bronze and brought him to Babylon. And when he was in distress, he entreated the favor of the Lord his God and humbled himself greatly before the God of his fathers. He prayed to him, and God was moved by his entreaty and heard his plea and brought him again to Jerusalem into his kingdom. Then Manasseh knew that the Lord was God. Manasseh is captured by the Assyrians, and it's something we wouldn't know if not for the book of Chronicles. Kings doesn't even mention it. But after he's captured, look at the specific words it used. When he was in distress, he entreated the favor of the Lord his God. He humbled himself greatly before the God of his fathers. He prayed to him, and God was moved by his entreaty and heard his plea. What was the theme of Chronicles? 2 Chronicles 7:14. If this my people, who are called by my name, will humble themselves, will turn and seek my face and pray, then God will hear, he will heal their land, and he will forgive them. Isn't it amazing how well that works out? The exact words from the theme are used in Manasseh's account. Manasseh humbled himself. This was Manasseh, who we just read in 2 Kings, ruined the nation of Judah. He killed his own children to sacrifice to a god. And this man, while being brought low by the nation of Assyria, humbled himself. He prayed to God. He turned and sought him, and the Lord forgave him. For all the terrible things Manasseh had done, God forgave Manasseh. Now, the judgment pronounced in Kings, that's still going to happen. Manasseh's actions aren't without consequence. They're still going to be taken into captivity because of Manasseh's actions. But Manasseh, he repents. He does exactly what 2 Chronicles 7:14 tells him to do, and God restores him back to his kingship. We even see that in the verses after his repentance, he goes on and he reigns as king of Judah pretty successfully after that. He rebuilds the walls and he fortifies the nation, and he even turns the people to start worshiping God instead of the false idols. This is the true story of Chronicles, is redemption. Someone as terrible as Manasseh can be brought back to God. And that's the point I want to make with Manasseh. There's no hole that you can be so deep in your life that you still can't see the light of God at the end. You can always get back to him. You just have to humble yourself. You need to pray, and you need to seek God. And God can save you from wherever you are in your life. The next story that I want to highlight from Chronicles is Hezekiah's Passover from 2 Chronicles chapter 30. Hezekiah was one of the best kings of Judah. Definitely top 3, top 4, if you're one of those people that like ranking things for no reason. And Hezekiah's Passover is not something that's mentioned in the book of Kings. In Kings, when it talks about Hezekiah, it mentions how he prayed to God and was saved from Sennacherib, king of Assyria. And it mentions a lot of different really good things that Hezekiah does towards God. But it focuses less on his spiritual life and more on what he does as a king. Chronicles has a lot more about Hezekiah's spiritual life. And you see this in 2 Chronicles chapter 30. The story, for those that are unfamiliar with, is Hezekiah had just become king of Judah. About 5 to 7 years before Hezekiah became king of Judah, the nation of Israel was taken into captivity by the Assyrians. Assyria came in, wiped out the nation of Israel, and took most of its inhabitants off into slavery or exile. However, there are some people that still remain in the nation of Israel. They're a remnant. The Passover is coming up, and it's the first Passover of Hezekiah's reign. And so Hezekiah sees the Passover coming up, and if you've studied the Bible, you know how important the Passover is to God's people. It's a feast to remember what God had done and how he brought them out of Egypt. And there's strict rules for how you're supposed to follow it because it's that important to God. And so the Passover is coming up, and you can tell just how good of a king Hezekiah is because he reinstates the Passover. Passover hadn't been celebrated for a while because of how many wicked kings of Judah had been reigning up until Hezekiah. And so the Passover is coming up, and Hezekiah sees the people in the north, in Israel, that remain, and he sends them a message. He gathers together many different couriers and messengers, and he writes a message for them. And this is that message. O people of Israel, return to the Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, that he may turn again to the remnant of you who have escaped from the hand of the kings of Assyria. Do not now be stiff-necked as your fathers were, but yield yourselves to the Lord and come to his sanctuary, which he has consecrated forever, and serve the Lord your God, that his fierce anger may turn away from you. For if you return to the Lord, your brothers and your children will find compassion with their captors and return to this land. For the Lord your God is gracious and merciful, and will not turn his face from you if you return to him. There were many times throughout the history of the divided kingdom where they were at war with each other. They didn't always get along. And now Israel has been taken into captivity by Assyria. What does Hezekiah do? Does he point and laugh and say they got what they deserved? They were sinners, and God executed judgment on them. It's not what Hezekiah does. Hezekiah sees those people that are still remaining. He sees that the Passover, the feast for remembering what the Lord has done for them, is coming. He wants them to come and worship with him. He invites the Israelites down to the nation of Judah to celebrate the Passover. And so he writes this message, and he gives it to many different messengers and couriers and sends it out. And first off, you see that most of the messengers are laughed at. The people that remain in Israel, many of them are still wicked. They laugh at the messengers Why would we want to go and worship the Passover in Judah? However, there's some people that have a different response. Verse 11 of 2 Chronicles 30. However, some men of Asher, of Manasseh, and of Zebulun humbled themselves and came to Jerusalem. Some people heard the message, and they come. And so these people are coming down to Judah to celebrate the Passover. But there's a problem. We know, if anyone's ever spent any time in the books of Leviticus and Deuteronomy and Numbers, there's rules about how they were supposed to consecrate themselves and celebrate the Passover. These people up in the north, the Bible wasn't being taught to them. They weren't studying the old laws, and they didn't know how they were supposed to act. These people in the north were invited to celebrate the Passover, and they had no clue how they were supposed to celebrate it. What does Hezekiah do here? Does he laugh at them? Does he kick them out and say that they're not worthy to celebrate before the Lord because they don't know how to consecrate themselves? Hezekiah prays. Starting in verse 18 of 2 Chronicles 30. May the good Lord pardon everyone who sets his heart to seek God, the Lord, the God of his fathers, even though not according to the sanctuary's rules of cleanness. And the Lord heard Hezekiah and healed the people. There's those words again. God heard. God healed. That's what happens when people humble themselves. When they turn and seek God to celebrate the Passover, God heals them. These people had no clue how they were supposed to act. We don't see judgment on them. We see forgiveness. We see love. And it's all thanks to Hezekiah and the love he showed for these people. There's three points I really want to make from this. There's those of us, we're redeemed. We're saved. But we need to help others reach salvation. Hezekiah was the king of God's people. But he wants to bring more to God. Not for his own power, but for the hearts and the souls of those lost people. You even see, if you finish up reading chapter 30, if you ever read it in your spare time, at the end of it, let's see. Verse 26, this is the reaction of the people after Hezekiah does this. So there was great joy in Jerusalem, for since the time of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel, there had been nothing like this in Jerusalem. There had been nothing like this in hundreds of years. That's how much Hezekiah's prayer and love and compassion changed these people. Help others reach redemption. The next point is having love and compassion for the lost. We can be so quick when we see people that are different from us, and we just want to judge them. We see what they're doing wrong, and we want to lift ourselves up by focusing on, we're not doing that. How can you struggle with this sin when I don't? And we don't understand that. If you have love and compassion for people, you don't put people down so that you're higher. You lift them up to you, towards God. And this is the kind of love and compassion we need, the kind Hezekiah had. Finally, we need to pray. Pray that people's knowledge of God will grow to match their love of God. I think there's a lot of times when people visit at church, and it's not hard to tell. You can see some people, and right away you know, I don't think this person has ever been to church before. You can see that. What do? Do you judge them for the way they're dressed? They may not be dressed appropriately. They may be dressed immodestly or in a sinful way. What is your attitude towards them, though? Do you pray for them? Do you love them and want to bring them to God? Or do you just say hurtful things about them to the other members here? Do you just talk about these people behind their back because they don't know? They came here to worship God. Did you help them? Or did you mock and ridicule them just like the remnant of Israel mocked and ridiculed Hezekiah? So this is something I want us to remember whenever we see people out in the world that aren't saved, is we need to bring them to God. If they love God, we need to pray that their knowledge will grow to match their love instead of tearing down their love so they never get that knowledge. The final story is found in 1 Chronicles chapter 21, and it's the story of David's redemption. We all know the phrase about David. It's probably impossible to talk about David without saying this at some point. David was a man after God's own heart. And it's not because he never sinned. The story of David is full of his sins. We know so many. He sins with Bathsheba. He doesn't handle things right with his children, and that leads to Absalom overthrowing him and all sorts of turmoil in his life. And then we have this sin about in 1 Chronicles 21 where David numbers the people. David is not a man after God's own heart because he never sinned. He's a man after God's own heart because of how quickly he came back to God. There's few people in the Bible that so quickly and adamantly turn back to God when they realize they're wrong. As soon as David realizes he is wrong, he does everything in his power to fix himself before the Lord. And that's the story of 1 Chronicles 21. David numbers the people. We don't know why this was such a terrible thing. The Bible doesn't say. We know it's a terrible thing because of Joab's reaction. David commands Joab, go out, number the people. And Joab said, I can't do this, David. This is a terrible thing in the sight of the Lord. However, Joab does it because David is God's anointed king, and Joab listens to the king. It's so terrible to Joab, he doesn't even finish numbering the people. He numbers about 8 or 9, if I remember correctly, tribes, and then quits numbering the people and returns back to David. And this was a terrible thing in the eyes of God. And so, God sends a prophet to David telling him, you messed up. And the prophet gives him 3 different options for how he can choose to be punished. David, he realizes he's done wrong. He accepts his punishment. He picks the punishment that puts him in the hands of the Lord and not the hands of his enemies. And so God sends a pestilence upon the nation of Judah. And the pestilence kills 70,000 men of Israel. Die because of David's sin. That's how severe David messed up. 70,000 people die. The angel of the Lord has a sword drawn, stretched out over Jerusalem, and God relents from his destruction. He says enough. And so the prophet of the Lord goes back to David and tells him, here's what you got to do to make things right. I want you to build an altar and sacrifice to the Lord. And so David goes to Ornan the Jebusite. That's always a fun name. He goes to Ornan and he goes to buy the land from him. And Ornan, he's talking to the king. He's talking to David. He tries to give him everything. He says, take this land. You're the king. Take the sacrifice. I will give you everything you need to sacrifice. David utters one of the best quotes in the Bible. I will not give to the Lord that which cost me nothing. And so David purchases everything from Ornan. He builds the altar and he sacrifices it. Now, this whole story up to this point is found in Kings. But there's one small difference between the account in Kings. Sorry, it's not in Kings. It's in Samuel at this time because it's David. This whole story is in Samuel. But in Chronicles, there's one slight difference. And that's verse 26 of 1 Chronicles 21. And David built there an altar to the Lord and presented burnt offerings and peace offerings and called on the Lord. And the Lord answered him with fire from heaven upon the altar of burnt offering. When you read the story in the book of Samuel, it doesn't mention the fire from heaven. God sent fire from heaven onto David's sacrifice to show him he was pleased with it. It doesn't mention that in Samuel. Why is that so important? Why does it matter that God sent fire from heaven down to the sacrifice? It shows David was instantly redeemed. David had messed up severely, so bad that 70,000 men of Israel died because of it. And God forgives him. And God doesn't forgive like we forgive. No, if this was people, if I'm spending time with my best friend and I do something that severely hurts him, I lie about him, I cheat him, I steal from him, and then I come back to him and he shows me the error of my ways, things would be awkward between us. Even after I do everything I can to ask him to forgive me, things aren't the same. I've tarnished my relationship with that friend. God's not like that. He forgives differently from people. David's relationship with God is fixed completely. Could you imagine harming anyone the way we harm God and that person still acting like you're their best bud afterwards? It's amazing, the forgiveness God gives us. We try, but it's almost impossible for man to just forget about the past actions like that. But God, you do what he tells you to do, and you're right again in his eyes. 2 Chronicles 7:14. I'll turn there because I tried to quote it last time and I got a couple things out of order. If my people, who are called by my name, humble themselves, and pray and seek my face, and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven, and will forgive their sin, and heal their land. Chronicles shows us the way back to God. Through the story of Manasseh, we see we can always return to God. You've never messed up so bad that there's not forgiveness for you. Now, you don't get it without asking for it. You don't get it without following God's ways, but you can get it. No matter how badly you've messed up, you can make it back to God. We need to help others come to God, worship God, love each other, love the people out in this world so that you want to bring them to God. Focus your actions on bringing more to Christ instead of sending people away, like Hezekiah did. And then remember, God forgives differently than we do. You can be right again in God's eyes. Some people will really struggle with this if you've been a Christian your whole life. You know you should know better, but you do something awful. You sat in this church building 3 days a week your entire life, and then people find out about that thing you've kept secret your whole life. You don't know how anything will ever be the same again. You should know better. God forgives you of that. And we'd have no hope without that. God showed us through David that he will forgive you through the fire on the altar. Today, we can be redeemed, just like these characters were. However, God doesn't redeem anymore with fire. Today, we're redeemed through blood and through water and baptism. If any of you today have not been redeemed, if you've not devoted your life wholly to God in baptism, then please come forward as we stand and as we sing.